All right, Ted. Thanks for doing this.
Well, you're welcome. Thanks for asking me.
So I thought that as we get ready to do the virtual open house this year, the Beckman open house for 2021, and given that we have constraints on how we can do that, I thought, well, there's no better way to spend time learning about the history of Beckman. Here we are, 3 decades in, working on our fourth decade, and it's a great opportunity to bring back Director Emeritus Ted Brown. So I think that I have asked around, and there's a lot of interest and many questions that people have wondered about, and maybe we can get to some of those.
Sure. I'd be glad to talk about any of them.
I think it's really good to put this all in context by maybe rather than me reading your bio, which is the standard practice of doing things, just maybe you could give me a brief history from your perspective on, your start with the University of Illinois, but you began as a chemistry faculty member and had several positions in leadership. So leadership was nothing strange to you on campus. Why don't you pick it up from when you arrived at the University of Illinois?
Yeah, I can do that. When I came here, I came in a rather lowly position. Actually, I was appointed an instructor in the chemistry department. It was a time. This was 1956, and it was a time when the university was growing, and they were hiring new faculty. They had a position open in chemistry and for inorganic chemistry, and it was filled by Stan Piper. So I figured I wasn't going to be going to Illinois. But then it turned out that the DuPont company offered them some money to put some faculty positions in that were temporary, but 2-year appointments as DuPont fellows, they called them. And there was an expectation that they might convert into a tenured faculty position. And that was good for me, actually. I was a little disappointed that I didn't get the job in the first place, but I had already been interviewing with DuPont, wanted to go to Central Research to interview. Something came up that I couldn't do that. But I always had this feeling that maybe that's really where I belonged. And they were pushing me pretty hard to try to find a teaching position because at Michigan State, they never had a graduate who went on to teach in a major university. So I was, in a way, mollifying them a little bit. Anyway, I accepted this temporary appointment at Illinois. So I came with my family thinking, well, if I don't like it, DuPont had already told me they'd be happy to have me come interview at Central Research. And so anyway, I started out as an instructor, and I had good luck to be somewhat, in the terms of that time, a little bit interdisciplinary. My faculty advisor at Michigan State was a guy named Max Rogers, and he measured dipole moments. Now that doesn't sound like much of a thing to do, but dipole moments were a technique that people used a lot in the older days in especially in organic chemistry, because we didn't have NMR. We had infrared, but even that was a fairly new technique. And so often you made decisions about whether you had a cis or trans isomer or and so forth by measuring the dipole moment. Well, I didn't learn from that. So Max, who was a physical chemist and had a dipole moment apparatus set up, always got a lot of attention from organic people who were sending in samples all the time to measure the dipole moments. So when I went to Illinois, I thought, well, I'd like to get started on doing this. And I asked for money from the research board to build a small dipole moment measuring apparatus. It was actually constructed from World War II surplus equipment and some other stuff like a water bath and so on. The whole bill came to about $350. That was my first grant from the research board. And I set it up. And of course, there was that place across the street from the chemistry building where the faculty used to get coffee.
Right.
What was the name of that place? I've forgotten it now. But I got to know the organic chemists. Because I had done research in my thesis work on organolithium compounds, the organickers were interested in that. But then they found out that I could measure dipole moments. And so pretty soon I had collaborative work with Nelson Leonard and Doug Applequist and David Curtin, and I published several papers with these guys. I got my name on the paper because I had done the dipole moment measurements. So actually that advanced my career. I think it helped me a lot. That and a few other things. I made tenure. And I had been a physical chemist in my PhD work, and I didn't really know a damn thing about inorganic chemistry. I had taken a course out of Thorold Moeller's inorganic chemistry book. Here now I found myself teaching general chemistry, and I was in the inorganic division. Well, I continued to do work in organolithium chemistry and that sort of thing, but I was really having to struggle to learn, the inorganic chemistry that you taught in not in the general chemistry so much, but in more advanced courses. So gradually I converted myself into an inorganic chemist, and they granted me tenure. There's several stories about that too. Don't have time for right now, but I made tenure, but I was a member of the inorganic division, and so they.
When did your leadership roles begin?
Well, I mean, this is where I'm getting to this now. The John Baylor was the head of the division of inorganic. It was a very divisionalized department. He was the head of the inorganic division and the director of general chemistry, and so. A
silo within the silo.
Yeah, right. That was very much so. You couldn't. In fact, because I'd been trained in physical chemistry, this is a little off the topic, but I always harbored this hope that maybe I could be received into the physical chemistry division. There was somehow more status associated with that than being in this general chemistry and inorganic chemistry division. So I went to talk to Herb Gutowski, who a few years older than me and now the head of the physical chemistry division. And he assured me that my credentials did not stand up for an appointment in the physical chemistry. No, it just simply wouldn't do. I had done work with a physical chemist, and Max Rogers, with whom I had gotten my degree, was not a slouch. I mean, he had gotten his PhD with Linus Pauling, but neither was he, a big name guy, and I had not done a terrific thesis for a lot of reasons, which we won't go into. So I wasn't going to get appointed to physical chemistry. So okay, I settled for that and just went ahead and did the kind of research that I wanted to do, talked to the inorganic students about it and so on. And so then the time came to whether I wanted to be the head, but when John retired, they needed somebody to head the inorganic division. But that would have also required me to be the director of general chemistry. And I said, no, I can't do that. I won't do that. But I think you should hire somebody to be the director of general chemistry, quite separate from this other job. And so they did that. They hired Gil Haight to come in and be the director of general chemistry. And I became the head of the division, which was a nominal job at best. So that got me into a lot of committee work and so forth around the place. And I was, I don't know what you'd call them leadership roles, but I had a propensity for getting into things. And I was already involved with some things on campus. For example, I came there in 1956. In 1967, that was the centennial year of the university celebration. And they were putting together a committee to put on this really huge celebration of the centennial year. And I was asked to be on that committee. David Pines was the chair of it. There were a lot of names on there, people. And that was a great year. I learned a lot of things from that, and I made friends all the way across.
So you were, at that point, really starting to reach outside of chemistry across the boundaries and make connections with colleagues in other units.
Well, I also, even before that time, there were some people over across Green Street there that really interested me. There was a guy named Heinz von Förster, who was an amazing man, he had his own department. It was really a school of biology and computation or something like that. Well, Heinz was way ahead of his time. He was well known. He published a lot of things. He gave a seminar. He had groups over to his house. And I went to these things. I thought they were really interesting. He published a paper in which he projected that in the year 2027 or something like that, the human population would grow to the point where there was only 1 square meter per person available for land. And he got it published in Science magazine. it was the kind of provocative thing he did, he was very interested in population studies. And there were people like that that I got to know. I remember being invited to their house they invite people over for drinks and talk and conversation. So Audrey and I went to those things. And so I got to be known. I wasn't, nobody thought I was going to be a leader in those fields, but I was welcome to come and learned a lot of stuff from them. And then I got asked to be, I think, I don't know when it came about that I was asked to be on the research board. And so I went on the research board. By that time, I was a full professor already and doing really well. But the research board taught me a whole lot of things about the campus. You had to really be broad-minded to be on the research board. Ned Goldwasser was the vice chancellor for research, and he had just become the director of the vice chancellor for research. He had come from being the associate director of the big accelerator up in Illinois up there.
Fermi? Was it the Fermi? Or?
Yeah, he was the associate director of Fermi Lab. He didn't get made director when the original director retired, and so he came back to Illinois. He had been a faculty member at Illinois. So he took this job, and so I was on the research board. Actually, I may have been on the research board even before he started. That's right, I was. There was a guy named George Russell who was the vice chancellor for research, and I was on the research board during his time. Well, you learn a lot of being on the research board, and I really enjoyed that quite a lot. And so I don't know how it came about that they were looking for someone to be the vice chancellor for research. Ned had been, and he moved up to the vice chancellor for academic affairs, and they needed somebody to be the vice chancellor for research. So they asked me if I would. They'd been looking. No one wanted to take the job, and they were after me to do it. By this time, this was 1978, 79, and I eventually, after thinking it over for a long time, I decided I would give it a try and go into administration. And I took this job, which was vice chancellor for research and dean of the graduate college. They were held by one person at that time. But before that, because of my being on the research board, I had been invited. This gets us into the business about Arnold Beckman, so maybe I'll stop at that point. So that's how I got into administrative life, through this kind of circuitous thing. I guess I was a good committee person. I was on a lot of committees around the campus during the unrest of the 60s. I was on faculties having to deal with the social unrest among the African American students and so forth. And a couple of us, I was on the first faculty committee on affirmative action with a couple of other faculty members, and we made a little noise and caused a little trouble. So, I was considered a little bit to the left of proper or something like that. But anyway, not so much so that my reputation was spoiled.
I think that frames things very well. And the only other maybe tidbit that you can comment on, since you passed through the history, was I think it was in the early 70s when you wrote your book on energy and sustainability. What was the title of that again?
Energy and the Environment. Well,
how did that come to be? I mean, what drove you there? Well,
that starts back when I was a graduate student at Michigan State. I took a physics course in boundary value problems from a fellow by the name of Gilbert Ploss, who was a visiting professor at that time. He had been in some government laboratory in the East, I've forgotten just what, but he taught this boundary value problems course. Great teacher, but his research interest had to do with the infrared profile of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. This was a time, way before, we're talking now 1950, 55, 54, 55. And, their computers were, there wasn't any really, so a lot of hand work was done. And Gilbert Ploss was concerned about carbon dioxide the rises and increase in the concentrations of carbon dioxide. So he gave a course on what they were doing and how they came to measure the things that they measured. And I just thought, wow, this is something I'd never heard of before. I really got interested in it. got his reprints and started reading other things. And it just became sort of a sideline with me. I just kept up on the literature, not reading the deep stuff. But so by the time 1970, well, in the 60s, I was interested enough in it, and I had read enough about it to think this could be a serious problem for society. And so one summer, instead of spending the entire summer doing research and being paid by my research grant, I took off about half the summer, and my family and I rented a cottage up on the shore of Lake Michigan. I packed a big box full of all the reprints and other stuff that I had on that subject, and we went up to this place. It was a gorgeous house, not gorgeous, but really nice, sitting on the dunes overlooking Lake Michigan. And I put this thing up in my bedroom, and for we were there for about almost 2 months, and I wrote this little book in that course at that time. And I was, of course, I didn't have access to the library. I had only what I had packed. But so I brought home an incomplete manuscript, but I was able to finish it up pretty fast. And then I tried to find a publisher, and I had trouble with that. But eventually, because I already at that time had written a textbook with Charles E. Merrill, when things really got to past Pat Hayes, who was the director of the chemistry, he was the chemistry editor there, said, we'll publish the book for you, and we'll make it a real paperback with recycled paper. We'll make it really cool. This will be this is the time for the new age. And so that's how the book got published. And actually, it was meant to be a little textbook, but I had hopes that it would become a sort of general reader book. It didn't really do that, but it was there were quite a few schools that used it. I mean, I remember getting a note from Roald Hoffman. He had started a course. He was interested in science and society at the time, and he taught a graduate course, actually, or maybe it was an undergrad course at Cornell. And he used the book, and he thought it was really fine. So I got a lot of satisfaction, and I certainly learned a hell of a lot by writing that book. And
well, Ted, it's to the point that I think, you've been ahead of your time on many instances. And that just is an example of, I think before this was on certainly the general society's radar, you were already latched on and realizing some of the, roads that we were heading down.
It's true. And, I've always, Jeff, I've been amazed. You are a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and recently you got a big yellow covered issue from them, Witnessing Climate or something like that, or Witnessing Climate Change. And I've read that in almost the entire book, and surprises me how many of those people are in going along, recording their own awareness of the issues, began to realize only about this time in the 70s that there was a problem. It's almost a revelation that came upon them. I thought, where in the hell have you guys been? I mean, there were people talking about this, nobody was listening much, though. And it was a subject that grew very slowly. And even today, some people just think they're really original by writing about it because they learned last year about it or something like that. It's not a subject, it just sort of creeps up on you because of so much of it is invisible. So that book got me, and then I took sabbatical leave in 1972. I had a sabbatical leave at the International Meteorological Institute in Stockholm. So we went there, and I went there because the director of that institute was, I'm going to lose his name here at the moment, but he was a leader in this field of sort of keeping track of the budget, the carbon dioxide budget in the atmosphere. And so I wrote to him and asked him if I would be interested, if I could come there as a visitor for a semester. And I had my faculty half salary, and I may have had I don't think I had any other money at that time, but he offered, I said, please do come. And they offered me a stipend and some money toward the rent. And so Audrey and I and the three of our kids packed up and we went to Stockholm. And that was the year in which the first international conference on the environment was held in Stockholm. And it was a wild and woolly conference. There were black covered students running around with protest flags all over the place. And I was right in the middle of it because the International Meteorological Institute was right downtown. And so it was an easy walk over to watch the fun. And but it turned out that this fellow, gosh, I wish I could think of his name. He was very much of a politician, and he was actually very much involved in setting up this international conference. And so he didn't have time much to talk to me. He was very gracious, but he didn't really talk to me much. And so I had to find other things to do, which I did, but it didn't lessen my interest in the climate change. I went home still determined. And you know who else was at the Institute at that time was Paul Crutzen, who later got the Nobel Prize for his work in the calculating the effects of nitric oxide in the stratosphere. And I got to know Paul pretty well. We went to dinner with them. They had a family, they had a couple of kids about the same age as ours. So we went to dinner at their house and back and forth a couple of times. So it was a very interesting time. It was a very international group, but there were very few chemists in the place, whatever. There was one guy that I shared an office with whose research interest was in the acidity of the northern lakes in Sweden. So he was away most of the time measuring pH up in those lakes. And I had the office pretty much to myself. I spent a lot of time just wandering around Stockholm, and that's what sabbatical leaves are for. And I did do a lot of work on metal ions and metal atoms in the mesosphere, which I knew nothing about when I went there. But there again, I picked up a hint from a good friend. I'd become a good friend of his, and he was doing rocket studies up in the northern part of Sweden to measure sodium in the upper atmosphere, in the mesosphere. And I said, sodium in the atmosphere? He said, oh yeah, free sodium is up there, And I couldn't believe that. So I had to go dig in the literature and say, how is it possible there could be free sodium at 90 kilometers elevation? So that got me into that field, and I did quite a bit of work and modeling and published one paper on its subject, but it didn't become part of my research effort.
So through the late 70s and early 80s, when Arnold Beckman was first making an announcement, or how did that all come to be that there was before the Beckman Foundation, there was maybe a hint that there might be an opportunity to do something big on campus?
Well, Arnold was an alum of U of I and a loyal alum. He was a member of the foundation board, U of I Foundation board. He came to the board meetings almost every year, he and his wife, Mabel. And so he loved Illinois. He had grown up in Cullum, which is just 70 miles north of that. And of course, by that time, he'd gotten to be quite a rich man. And so in 1978 or thereabouts, the university undertook the first big fund drive, the first mega drive is whatever they call those things. And so they wanted to find some large donations. So they asked Arnold if for $5 million. I was on the research board at that time. And this is in the period like from 76 to 80. I was on the research board. So they had a foundation meeting in 1978, and Arnold and Mabel came, and they arranged for Audrey and me to go to dinner with the Beckmans. I never met Arnold Beckman. The other couple that was at that dinner were Howard Momstad and his wife. Howard was a faculty member in analytical chemistry. So we had a very nice dinner and got to know Arnold a little bit that way. And so they kept after him about this. They wanted him to give $10 million to provide an endowment for the research board, which had a pittance of an endowment. And so they didn't have a whole lot of money to give out. But I had gone along to this dinner. I was there because I was a chemist and because I was on the research board, which is, I could tell Arnold about what the research board did and so on. So Arnold eventually did decide to give money. His argument was, look, I don't see why I should give money to a public university. I love the Illinois, but the people of Illinois should support this place. Why are you asking me for this money? And their argument was, well, the research board is different. We can't get much out of the budget. We can't get the state to put money in that, but the value of it for the faculty and those who get the money is great. So he was finally convinced that he could do something, but he was still very leery about it. So instead of giving them 10 million, he gave them $5 million. And it came in the form of $2.5 million worth of Beckman stock, and 2,000 acres of land up near Cullum. That was valued at $2.5 million. So the two pieces together made $5 million. And he said, you have to give that other $5 million from somebody else. And they managed to find the other $5 million. But of course, he didn't want us to sell the stock right away. And he certainly didn't want us to sell the land, because the land was being tenant farmed by some friends, family friends.
Right.
And so we could get the income from the land, which was not very much compared with what the same amount of money would have produced in the market. And but still, it was an addition to the endowment, and that was very much gratefully received. So in 1980, that's when that gift was announced. And it was just that year that I had accepted the position of Vice Chancellor for Research and Dean of the Graduate College, which made me the person who was chair of the research board. So now I had this extra money, and here was Arnold. And so Lou Barron, who was the director of the Beckman University of Illinois Foundation, was a very clever and strategically minded person. He knew that this was the first wedge. He wasn't about to let Arnold get away with that kind of money, So, but he didn't want to talk about it in Arnold's terms. So during that time, in 1983, I started with. Let me say first of all, I was very much aware that Arnold liked attention and so forth, as he well might. So as soon as I got in the job, we started doing things like we created the Arnold Beckman annual lectureship in science and innovation, and he gave the first lecture, and Jim Watson gave the second lecture, and the guy who invented Polaroid film, what was his name, gave the third. So we had some really big names giving these lectures. He loved that, and he was coming to town because he had all this money which had just occurred to him because he had merged his company with SmithKline to form SmithKline Beckman, and the corporate headquarters were in Philadelphia, and so he was being flown back and forth between California and Philadelphia by corporation jets, and he could get off at Champaign-Urbana and stay overnight, have the jet wait for him, and then go on. And he liked being on the campus. And when he came, I made it a point to arrange a schedule for him. So we were using some of his money to make special grants, Beckman grants to the faculty in the science, not only in the sciences, but in some of the other fields. So you got a Beckman grant. That meant that it was a cut above the normal. And then I arranged for him to go to the
offices and labs of these people. I'd go with him, and we'd meet these guys, and they would tell Arnold what they were doing. Oh God, he loved that, So he wanted to do these things, and we would go around. I think, for example, Jerry Jonas might have gotten one of those back in those days, and I remember going to Jerry's lab, and he was telling him all about these high pressure NMR measurements he was doing. So all of that happened, and what it was doing. I can't say that I was smart enough to be strategic about it. I just wanted him to be happy that he'd given us the money. But what was happening was that we were building in his mind, a sense of trust about the campus and about the university. And he really liked what was going on here because he didn't know that much. The other thing that happened during that time, every time he came, not every time, but very often, we would go to Cullum. He loved to be in Cullum. And when Mabel was healthier, the two of them went. Stan Eikenberry would lend them his car, which he had by virtue of being the president and the driver, and they would take him up, and him and Mabel, to Cullum. Later on, when he wanted to go there, this was after Mabel had passed away and so forth, he and I would drive up there, and I would drive my own car. But in those earlier days, he liked to go to Cullum and to see. He still had a lot of cousins and people up that way, and he just loved the place. And the people who lived on that 2,000 acres of land, they didn't live on the land; they lived in a small house, but they farmed the 2,000 acres. We always went to their house for lunch if we were up there. Mrs. Harms, Marion Harms, and her husband Henry. So got to know all those people. So that was stuff that happened during those times, and So in 1983, Lou Barron came to talk to, this is all in the book. I don't want to go into detail about it, but that sort of was the beginning of a relationship that kept getting more and more intense as time went by.
So in the proposal for the Beckman Institute, was the idea of an interdisciplinary research institute your idea, or was that developed in partnership with Arnold, or was it Arnold's idea? Talk about how that came to be.
It wasn't his idea. The whole point about making a proposal to Arnold Beckman was that he still adhered to this notion that he wasn't going to give money for a new chemistry building. I mean, that was not what he loved chemistry, but that was the state's job and not his job. And Lou Barron was a cagey, smart guy. He said, look, he didn't say Arnold's name at all. He could have had other alumni in mind as well. But we met with Mort Weir and Ned Goldwasser and John Cribbett and I. And he said, it's up to you guys. What we need from you is a proposal for something that's really different. I don't know what it would be, but it's up to you to think of it. But it's got to be something that the state of Illinois isn't going to do. So put your minds to it, and it should be big. We want some big ideas here. So he went away back to the foundation's office. And these other guys turned to me and said, well, Ted, you're the vice chancellor for research. Why don't you think of something? So because John Cribbett and Ned and I were formed what we called the Troika. We met all the time. This was a really nice relationship. He was the chancellor. Ned was the vice chancellor for academic affairs, and I was the vice chancellor for research. And we would meet every week or two, and we'd meet up in John's office. We'd all bring along all the problems that we had, and we'd spend 2 or 3 hours, trying to solve our common problems, or each one of us asking. It was a wonderful relationship. We just really got so much done that way. And Ned and I worked together a lot. But they said, look, Ted, this is up to you to do. Why don't you put it together and we'll work on it? So anyway, that's how I became the in charge of it. So I really, and I had already had experience as a vice chancellor for research with interdisciplinary stuff. I had put money into what was it called? A molecular biology laboratory or something. There was no place on campus where some of the newest technology like cell sorting and all these other things were available to the faculty.
Just the biotech center?
Well, it wasn't. It might have been.
It wasn't called that at the time.
But it was like it became a center. It was a campus-wide thing, and it was funded out of the graduate college. We had a budget for it. I got money from Ned for this, and so we had a director of it, and they did some of these measurements and things. But also, a bunch of these guys came to me from departments they were from psychology, computer science, linguistics, educational psychology, and they came to me at the graduate college and said, look, we have this group of people that we do this stuff together, and we all are we're all cognitive scientists, but there isn't a field called cognitive science, and we don't have any money, we don't have any way to run this group of ours. Can you give us a budget to get started doing some things? So I gave them money to run a seminar program and to support a couple of graduate assistants, research assistants. And the requirement I made was that those graduate assistants had to be doing the work of at least 2 faculty. They couldn't be working for just one faculty member. They had to be doing work that was jointly interesting to 2 people. And then the other money went for, so they had then they could form legally, and we formed a little center for cognitive science in the graduate college with a small budget. And so that was really an interdisciplinary enterprise, that we got started. So we had a couple of things like that going. And, from all of the experience I had as a graduate dean and the things I knew already about the campus, I think, I could see where we just had to really think really broadly and deeply to come up with something that was going to be really interesting. And so I started just doodling, and then I suggested that we form a couple of committees, one on the life and behavioral sciences side and the other on the engineering and physical sciences side, and turn these guys loose and say, why don't you think what you can do what could you do if you had a lot of money to make a center? What would it look like? Who would be in it? How would you interact with one another and so on? So those two committees were formed, and eventually Carl Hesbit chaired one and Bill Greeno chaired the other. And I gave them a charter. I think that's in that book that I wrote about the
Bridging Divides.
Yeah, Bridging the Divide. So it's in there, the charter that I gave them. And it was a broad charter. I wanted them to really think broadly. And then we would see what we could produce from those two reports. And it took quite a long time. Some of the faculty that went on there originally quit after a couple of meetings and said, oh, this is a waste of my time. Nothing's going to happen from this. And so they gave up. But Carl and Bill kept at it, and I kept going to meetings and trying to encourage them. So eventually we did get 2 reports out of it.
Did you get a sense that the faculty were, that there was a group of faculty that really subscribed to this idea that interdisciplinary was going to be a rich opportunity to find and build new science around, or was it something
I think some did. Some people were just naturally inclined in that direction. Even if they weren't doing it themselves at the moment, they could see the advantages. For example, Peter Wolinus, the theoretical guy who was in the department at the time in chemistry. Pete really thought this was a great idea. He wasn't doing any, well, he was in a sense. I mean, everything a theoretician does is sort of interdisciplinary. You have to work on some problem. If you work on protein folding, you become a sort of biologist, and so Peter was naturally inclined in that direction. And some of the others felt the same way. Tony, guy in bio, there was a
Tony Crofts?
Tony Crofts, yeah. Tony Crofts was similarly inclined. He had a natural bent toward interdisciplinary stuff. And there were some others. And so, and Bill Greeno certainly crossed the boundaries a lot. He was in a department of psychology, but he was really a physiologist. And so we had some good people in there doing this stuff. And they got excited and interested in it. So, and mostly at that stage too, it wasn't so matter about how would you actually do it, but from an intellectual point of view, if you were going to do it, who would you do it with? How do you make these connections? Which groups would naturally form with others, and how would it look that way? And so the reports were very much organized to sort of along those lines. And then when the word got out that these committees were doing this, some of the other groups on campus thought, damn it, they didn't ask us what we thought. So they started submitting rogue reports. I had 2 or 3 big packages. One of them came from a bunch of people in the field of what's that name for ultrasonics. They were doing the group that was in the basement in the Beckman.
Oh, the BRL, the bioacoustics, right?
Bioacoustics people, yeah. And there were some people in that field that thought that they could make an interdisciplinary center. And there were some worthy things in there. None of them had the kind of breadth, but they wanted, to be thought of as contributing. And we did actually look at those things when we came to the point of deciding, who might be in there and who might not be. So then we got those reports, and we then played around with them, fiddled around with them for a long time, and worked with Bill and Carl, and we had we put together some stuff, and then Mort and I worked on that way of diagramming it. That Mort really was responsible for making that little triangle.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, well, he and I were, he was the one who sketched it out. We used to meet so regularly, and we'd spend hours together, and said, well, look, and made that little drawing, and it looked just, that's a nice way to look at it. So that became a kind of a logo for us, and it's so easy to represent things that way. So we began to use that successfully to talk about it.
Do you think on campus, sorry, I'm curious, besides the momentum was clearly building from your description, but were there also some naysayers who kind of thought this is a crazy lunatic idea? We must be able to spend that kind of money better in other directions.
Well, they didn't start thinking that until the money was there to talk about. But as far as the actual putting together of the proposals, there was a lot of well, actually, I'll tell you, some of the people were in the Center for Advanced Studies. Annette and I when I had something that I could look at, we took it over to the center professors and we showed them what we were thinking about. And some of them said, oh, for God's sake, Harry Drickemer said, oh, are you nuts? Anybody who gets in that sort of stuff is not a first-rate scientist. You can't be that way and be a first-rate scientist. You got plugged. But on the other hand, there were people like David Pines and others who thought it was great, and so we had a whole spectrum of people. John Bardeen kind of said, so we didn't get enthusiastic responses from the center professors, but we did get some useful help and ideas, and they all had their own notion, without having done all the homework that we had done about how it ought to be done. They all said, oh, well, you wouldn't want to do it that way. We'd do it this way, so on. But at least they were thinking along those lines, and they thought this was something that actually could be something. So we went back and kept working on it, and we went back to them. I didn't want to get to the point where we didn't have the support of the senior people on the campus, the senior scientists and so forth. And so they were kept in the loop. And Arnold Beckman met with them one time too. It was sort of not about that in particular, but just to introduce him to these people. Yeah, so that's how it finally eventually came together as a sort of rather sketchy proposal. And then he got that, and it wasn't detailed enough. I mean, he got I don't know what time he got this thing, but in the summer of '84.
This is Arnold who got it, right?
Arnold got it. And it came, of course, through the president. It goes to the foundation. The Sam Eikenberry is the one who delivered it. And I think we asked for. We didn't at that time. I'm not sure there was any dollar amount listed, but it was just a huge proposal. And then he came to the campus after that thing was around, and he looked at it in more detail one time. I think I mentioned this in that book. There was a meeting between Stan Eikenberry and Mort Weir and Arnold, and I don't know who else was there, not me. And he looked at all this stuff, and the president made this pitch to him about, we would really like for you to support this thing. And Arnold had looked all over this stuff, and he told, I wasn't there, but I'll take their word for it. I think it might have been Mort who said, he looked at all that stuff and he said, you people are talking about $50 million here. And that's exactly what it was. It turned out that we hadn't even mentioned numbers up to that point, but when we had an even conceptual drawing of a building, with two sides to it and so on. But he thought $50 million. And so in the end, when we had put all that stuff together and polished it up, the proposal that went to him in '84, in the summer of '84, was for $50 million. Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the building. First of all, the choice of its location, because I've always looked at our campus from my briefer history and thought that was a transformational change that really reshaped the north end of campus. So I'm really curious about the choices behind its location, and then maybe you can talk a little bit about the design thinking that went into it with this idea of interdisciplinary in mind.
Well, the choice of land, where to put it, partly it was that corner of at the corner of the Wright and University was where the first university building had been built, and the Illinois Industrial University was on that site. And so it had historical importance, and that was kind of a hook. But besides that, we didn't know where else to put it. If you wanted to give yourself plenty of room for space, because this was going to be big, right? I mean, this choice of land, by the way, came about only after the money had been given to us. We didn't tell this had nothing to do with it at the time we were trying to sell him on this. But once the choice had been made, that he had given us some money, and then he had given us $40 million. We asked for 50, and the state was required to put in another 10. So we had a $50 million project that included, by the way, that building next door to you there, that is the power plant, that keeps the,
Right.
so that was included in that, and a lot of money for furnishing the building. And we also had to buy land. We didn't own all the land east of the building. Matthew Street was not all ours, and so we had to exercise eminent domain and buy a bunch of land there to build it. But so we did have a budget for building that came out to be $40 million, more or less, in the end. And so that was a hell of a big building at that time. So there weren't very many places to put it. It seemed a little bit out of the way, but on the other hand, there was a vision there. We already owned a lot of the land. The university owned a lot of land on University Avenue going east from Matthew Street, all along there, all the way over to whatever that is, Lincoln Avenue. I forgot the street name.
That would be right. Yeah.
So we owned a lot of that land already anyway. And as you can see today, most of it's occupied by the university. But
That's what I mean.
It wasn't. So as soon as the decision was made to build the building there, then they hired the Sasaki and Company to come in and do a master plan for the North Campus. And they went in with a vengeance to design that whole North Campus. And so what followed afterward was in accordance with a plan, mostly, that was designed by Sasaki and Company. And Stan Eichenberg was very strong on this. He really wanted to see this. I mean, he thought, we have something here that we can do to create a whole new campus. This is going to be a new thing. It's not.
That's a big vision. I mean, because it really has a vision that now we can look back on and say it transpired very much. I mean, I don't know exactly what Stan's vision was, but we can certainly say that that vision has played out.
Yeah. Well, and also it was there was a campus planning office at the time. Fred Green was in charge of that, and they could see that if the university was going to grow, there were only certain directions it could grow. We couldn't keep going. You didn't want to keep marching into the housing of Urbana, over there east of Prospect. That didn't make sense. And this land up north there along University, first of all, it was, I don't think anyone was thinking so strategically they could think about relationships with Carl or Providence, the other hospital, which had various names, Mercy Hospital, I think it was at the time. We weren't thinking in those terms, but there was a feeling that maybe the university could grow north of University Avenue. But the main thing was that there was land up there to expand into. And so that's the way it went.
I'm curious about the design of the building. When did that start? When did you start imagining it? And you write about it in the book, but maybe you can talk a little bit about how that came to be, because it really broke tradition. I mean, in your book, for example, you write about how the laboratory was going to be separated from faculty offices.
Yeah.
And this was quite a revolutionary idea at the time, right? And it was, but it was in purpose. It was intentionally done.
That's right. It was all. I think, we were, Carl and Bill and I were really sort of the trio that thought most of these things through. We started pulling faculty together as soon as we knew that we were going to have to deal with a lot of people to make something work. And so we were having faculty groups and things, but we realized that if we were going to really do something different, we had to break the mold of the traditional laboratory fiefdom thing where, you had these little silos. Professor X has his office surrounded by laboratories which are occupied by students and postdocs, and then there's a boundary, and the next section over is Jones's kingdom and so forth. And so we wanted to break that, and we wanted it to be such that the faculty spent time with one another, learning from one another, which they don't like to do typically. So we put them all next to one another in these offices, and then put in that, the whole thing was designed to encourage people to interact with one another, faculty with faculty, faculty with their students. We had those open spaces outside the offices where you could have carols, and people have changed around a lot the designs, but the whole idea was that on the other side, the graduate students were also in spaces which mixed research groups together. And so it was all designed to kind of mix people up as much as possible, to make the bridges a place where people could meet. Yeah, you'd be surprised how much granularity we put into thinking about these things. Those bridges, for example, should they have chalkboards on the wall? Well, at first we didn't put them up, and then we decided later, or somebody did, that we should have them there. But places to sit. And you asked me the question in the letter you wrote me about, what about the Beckman Cafe? This was something that Bill Greeno and I both really felt strongly about. We both felt that we needed to have a cafe in that building. Bill had experience someplace else with a building with a cafe, and he said, it works. We know it works. And
it works in what way? Can you expand on that?
It brought people together. People love to eat, they like to drink, and depending on what kind of provisions you make for them, it doesn't take that much to get them to come together. Now, you're fighting against the stream of busy people who don't want to do that, they can't be bothered and so forth. And so, the cafeteria, I'm sure, has had its ups and downs. But for those who used it, and in the early days, it was, and then, what happened too, which was good, it brought over people from other buildings. We used to have a lot of civil engineers who came up there to use that thing. And then later on, some of the people from the Coordinated Sciences Laboratory, whatever that lab is called, that's right next to us there. And now I suppose people from the EE, although they probably have their own restaurant over there now. But this was an idea new for its time, and it brought people together in interesting ways, and it created a kind of, I don't know, even if people didn't use it, there was this feeling of hominess about it, that it just wasn't. It wasn't a Marriott hotel. It looked like a Marriott hotel, and Marriott hotels do have cafes in them, and that's all somewhat to the good. But this was a place that you could actually live in, in the sense of do things like eat, and so.
I think what you realize when you sit down and have a casual conversation with someone who's outside of your discipline is that, eventually you find the common ground. And you may not get there so easily if you're too focused on, a conversation that has a purpose that's very specific in mind, as opposed to a casual. I think that the term I've heard used is interdisciplinary socialization, and that socialization component of getting two people from very far apart is, I think, very important to the success of collaborations.
Well, I could feel that when we first moved in, we got people started, because most of these people didn't know very many people outside of their own group, really. That's what it came to. So I had these brown bag lunches once a week, I think they were, and we ordered lunches for people to bring. They brought them in, and there would be 10 or 12 faculty, and we would eat around in one of the meeting rooms there, those group meeting rooms. And so we'd get our lunch eaten, and everyone went around the table and spent a few minutes telling who they were and what kind of things they were interested in. And, by the time you do that with 10 people, you've used up your lunch hour. But there were times when you could see that bells were ringing. I can remember a couple of incidents where somebody, for example, from electrical engineering was interested in signal processing. I've forgotten the guy's name now. And might have been Al Feng or somebody else who was across the way. He said, "Holy hell, I do that." How do you tell one frog from another? And the guy said, "What do you mean they put frog from another?" And they were actually ended up spending a lot of time talking, maybe even collaborating. And it's that kind of realization that, we're treading on sort of common ground in a lot of areas. And it was really fun for me to learn about these things from the people. And I think that it helped to break down some of that, and did also the director seminars, which, as we were talking about that the other day, it doesn't always go as you'd like. That is, people tend to keep talking about their specialties, instead of talking to their neighbor, as it were,
right,
about what I do, and that's always a hard habit to break. But those are also things of that. So we tried other things. We had
assistantships that people could have, graduate students, but they had to be working for more than one person. Every little thing we could try, we did, to get people to interact. And I have to say, Jeff, that I was thinking about this today. In spite of all of that, we were fighting against a really, really strong tradition and way of doing ethos, And I was thinking there were in the early days, there were people who we were actually evicting people from the Beckman Institute. 1989, it opened up. 1991, we started kicking people out. They had joined, we had a group that they'd formed a group. They were going to be an interdisciplinary group. Well, they were interdisciplinary within their own little thing, but they didn't have much interest. And then when it turned out that not every one of them, lock, stock, and barrel, could come into the Beckman Institute, they could only be part-time there. The idea being you spent that time trying to get to meet others. Oh, hell, I don't want to do that. I want to be with my other brothers over here. So they weren't using their offices. And so Sarah Wasserman, who was my associate, and she was really a tough cookie girl. I loved her. She would put little things in their doors, to see how often they used their office. And they found out that, some of these people weren't using the office for 3 or 4 weeks in a row. And so we just said, we see that you're not using your office, and we thank you for your interest in the Beckman Institute, but we're going to reassign you. And, you can still be a part-time faculty member of the Beckman Institute, but you're not going to have an office here. And so
I think that's a really good point, because I've emphasized and tried to continue that line of thinking, and that it's about being present and how much that is important, to being in the building. Being present is really what makes those opportunities to where people meet and come together and the ideas are born.
Yeah.
You also had an interesting policy that you talked about related to this in the book, and I think that it met with some resistance from what I was able to read. Maybe you can expand on the idea that you won't have tenure in Beckman and that your time there is limited. And what was the thinking that went into that policy, and how was it received?
Well, we could see that if the Beckman Institute, we didn't use this terminology at the time we were writing about this and thinking about it, but really Beckman Institute is an organic structure. And you can't have situations where people are entitled to stay in place and have an organic structure. There always has to be that sense that I'm here because I have some purpose that serves the function of the building at large. And I will have to say that this was a very hard idea to get across. When I left the office at the end of 5 years, Jeff, we opened the door. Our initiation was in 89. Of course, I'd already been the director, but all through the building and all that stuff. But we really didn't get started, open the door and start working for sure till about 89, and I retired in 93. So 4 years later, I could look back and I could see that we had actually not done very well. We had a lot of good ideas, a lot of good programs. There were almost no major interdisciplinary collaborative efforts of size. People were still they're being interdisciplinary within their own little group. For example, we had a materials group that consisted of people from material science and chemistry and some other. They were all working sort of on the same kind of stuff. They just were, and it was interdisciplinary. But what I wanted was something bigger than that. I wanted, if you think about it in terms of steps, what's the distance between this idea and this one? If you're 2 feet apart, if you're 150 feet apart, that's interesting, right?
Right.
That's what you have to measure. What is the gap there, and how hard is it to close it? And so we weren't closing any of those longer gaps.
I think we've covered a lot of the points that I wanted to address. I would be curious, because you started talking about, that you didn't see the successes there early on, and the gaps that you were hoping to achieve were kind of small instead of those big large distances that you were hoping to cover. Looking back now, 3 decades later, have you been, is there anything particular that you have seen that you say, that's what we were after?
Well, I don't know. I'm not in a position to judge. I think what it looks like from the outside to me is really great. And, I have to say this, that I was about to say was that when I was finishing up my time, I realized that we needed to do had to need to get really strong about evaluating these programs. They were doing good science individually, but were they actually doing what we wanted them to do? Couldn't they be doing that just as well back home as it's in the Beckman Institute? So we started planning for the first set of evaluations. And so we laid out, by the time I left, I'd had a committee working on it. We had a program evaluation thing lined up. And then Jerry Jonas came in, and it became his responsibility to execute that. Now, that's the hard part, of course, making it work. And I have to say that Jerry did he did a magnificent job in 2 ways. First of all, he was tough, and he laid out a very firm plan of how to evaluate these things. And he was tough about acting on that and telling some people that they would have to leave. But thirdly, he realized that it isn't enough to just be tough. We have to teach people how to do this. And that's when he constructed this notion of these thrust areas. And when he said to each one of these thrust people, look, you're in thrust A. You've got to get to know the people in thrust A. And I expect you guys in thrust A to get yourselves together and be able to go out to DARPA or this place or that place that's offering a $5 or $10 million grant and put in a proposal. If you can't do that, you're not doing your job. Because that's what we missed. You see, at that time, we were no different than anybody else in that respect. So Jerry really took that and went with it. And that's, of course, that was my dream all along, but he had he knew how to do this. He was a really tough guy, and he executed. I might have done it too if I'd been able to stay around, but there's a certain point at which you use up your capital, as it were, and it wasn't for me to do that, but Jerry did that. And then from that point on, I would love to talk more about all these things. I've been thinking a lot about this whole notion about one of the questions you raised here about something about what do you think Beckman will be like 30 years from now and so on. I've gotten thinking a lot about that, and there's no time to talk about it now, but
well, we can go on if you have some thoughts on that. I'd love just to hear what you were thinking.
Going on here in 10 minutes, right? You have a meeting.
I have let's see. Yeah, I have about 10 minutes.
Yeah, well, I'll give you the short version. I've been thinking, that the Beckman Institute, this is not anything very novel, but like a lot of organizations, but maybe more than most, and certainly in academia, more than most organizations, it is actually an organic organization. That is, it develops organically. You said, well, what would the Beckman Institute be like 30 years from now? How the hell do I know? I couldn't tell you. For example, I couldn't have predicted almost anything that's going on in the Beckman Institute right now. And when I look back on it, it is because the Beckman Institute has been an organically developing organization. How does it develop organically? Well, that's all because of people, one way or another. Circumstances play a role, whether there's money for this or that and so on. But, when you go from one field, when you go from one line of emphasis to another, some people have to leave, others come in. People are making bets. They're making bets on the future. They're making bets about the intellectual quality of what goes on there. And they're thinking, what can I do with what I have here to make this work? And what can I do to find the right people or to pick the right directions in which to say, this is where when we hire, this is the area we want to hire into. It's a long ways off, but this is where we ought to go. And, I can only guess at a couple of things that I don't have time to talk to you about now. But I think that, we have to look way ahead, think about the fact that the world is changing in ways that we just, at a curious pace. We've got to think about how to live 20 years from now. How are we going to prepare for what life is going to be like 20 years from now? And it's going to be altogether different. We're going to have people living in cities
So if I were in the Beckman Institute and the director, I would start thinking about things like, I need to get in touch with architects and see what they can do to talk about what the city of the future will look like and bring people in who do this. I would talk about people, get to talk about people in AI and ask them, what is the future for human-like robots? And how can you imagine a future in which robots do all these things? And what about food? Imagine a world in which we don't use all that farmland for growing food anymore. It's now given back to grasslands. We raise all of the food in the cities. We do everything by vertical farming. These are all things that's just off the top of my head thinking, and there are probably a lot of better ideas than that. But this is, you say, if you think so, and then you look at, for example, Christakis, when you look at the kind of stuff he's doing, he is moving along this trajectory about neurosciences, which is understanding more and more about how we are made and how we react to the world. And we're learning more about that all the time. People like that, I think, are going to put their finger on where we have to go next. And
that's very interesting. That sort of brings me to, I think, what will be my final question, because I really liked how you framed the idea the jury brought, and this idea that we need people to come together as teams. And it really started, I think, this whole emphasis in that, there's much more than the sum of the individuals when you bring a group of people together who really, you actually touched on a key word that Arnold, you said, had begun to get trust with Illinois. And I think that, it's not just some effort to assemble the team, but those team members must begin to build the trust so that they can freely share ideas and exchange ideas. And you wrote about this in Making Truth, about how people can come together and begin to communicate and talk, and the ideas can span those gaps that you spoke of. But I'm really wondering, nucleating those teams, seeding those teams, it's coming from individuals, and individuals have this mindset that, I'm just going to work for myself, and I don't see the value in the team. And that was really the point of my last question about how we can recognize that there's a bigger win when we all come together.
Well, don't you think, though, Jeff, this is another point that I was going to make, and that is that what Harry Dickemer would say about all this stuff, he says, wow, you're not going to get any Nobel Prizes out of that place. All these people are milling around doing stuff. And it would not bother me a bit if we didn't get a Nobel Prize out of that place, because what the important things that are being done these days, many of them are not being done by individuals who couldn't possibly do them by themselves. There will be the continuous outstanding person who does something, and if we want them to do that, they could do it in the context of a place like the Beckman Institute. But that's not the measure. The measure is what does the place itself, as an organic whole, what does it do? If it produces, for example, you've got that College of Medicine there, and now it looks like the Beckman Institute is becoming, a powerful force in that. And if they're successful, and if they don't drift away too much from a goal of working collaboratively to accomplish a lot of these things that you want to do, it can become, a terrific thing. And that's what we should be known for.
Well, Ted, I'm going to wrap this up, but I really want to say how impactful your legacy has been on the campus of the University of Illinois, but even stretches far beyond that, because, if you just look at the history of interdisciplinary institutes, you can really see that there was a major shift that took place after the Beckman Institute had been established. And it had brought a lot of recognition in its early days for being so unique in that context. And so, as I go around, one of my favorite slogans is everybody wants to be like Ted. And, it truly is. I mean, we all look back and hope to have a legacy like the one that you have had at the University of Illinois. And I really appreciate the time, the insight. Maybe we'll have to do this again because I think there's a lot more to the story than what I was able to get out of.
Well, a lot of these things we talked about today are great kinds of conversations to have over a cup of coffee or sometime and just kick them around and come back. I wish I were closer. I'd pester you more, but I do think about these things. Actually, I can't say that I think about these things all the time, but you prompted me to do it by asking these questions. And I realized that, there are some things there that I hadn't really thought about much before. And I do have some thoughts about each one. Each one of those we could talk for a long time. What could be better? What is the role of Beckman today now that interdisciplinary collaboration isn't so rare? I mean, I have to think about that one, but there are a lot of it. Everybody wants to be interdisciplinary these days, and that's good. If we manage to see that, even though nobody recognizes that we were one of the pioneers in it, but
everybody wants to be the game changer. What's going to change what's going to move the needle? And I just look at the Beckman Institute and I say, that's it right there. How do you reproduce that? How do you do that again? If you can do that once in 50 years, I think it's going to be really that is what the university will be sustained by.
But it won't look like the Beckman Institute, Jeff. It'll be It'll be a creative something, and it'll be something along the lines of saying, it seems to me that if you don't look at the world outside, if you just stick yourself in the middle of academia and think, well, what do we do here? You're going to miss it. What you have to look at is the world that's coming. It's changing right around us, and you can't say you're not affected by it. And individually, we're all affected by it. And 10 years from now, God knows what we're going to have. But what can we do to try to help humanity find its way out of these messes? And I think there's a place for academia in this. People would want to brush it aside and say, no, this is now time for the boys to roll up their sleeves and do it and so forth. But if we don't have a plan, if we don't have vision about what society can and should be doing, I mean, that book, that Witnessing Climate Change, was quite an interesting book. I didn't think I'd read that book. I was going to just put it up, like some of these other things, I just put it to one side. I've read almost all of the essays in it. Some of them are a little tiresome, but I tell you, I've underlined quite a few things in that book that struck me as maybe not even what the authors intended, but boy, they rang a bell with me. I thought there are things here to think about and to ponder upon when you're running a place like the Beckman Institute. So when you have time to do it, not that you're not busy, but it's worthwhile reading a few of those essays in there.
I think this is a great place to land the conversation. Yeah. But Ted, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to me. And I think that, it's going to be really a lot of interest to hear from your mouth the words of how, what we all walk into every day and take for granted, or at least when COVID is over, walk back into every day. And we've somewhat taken it for granted, but clearly there was just, a lot of behind the scenes thought and effort and hours of meetings that really helped to build that trust and take the Beckman Institute to plant it and to grow it up like it has. So thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Jeff. I really appreciate the opportunity. It's been very gratifying for me to talk with you today.